Now, let us talk about Chapter 1, Self-Trust over Social Doubt. In this chapter, we understand how a person builds trust in themselves and how they hold their ground amid social doubt. This chapter focuses on the idea that the biggest battle in life is not with people outside, but with the conflict that happens inside one's own mind. When a person thinks differently or takes a new decision, the first challenge they face is other people's opinions and judgments. At such times, if self-trust is weak, a person easily becomes confused and starts doubting their own decisions. Here, it is explained that social doubt often comes less from the outside and more from within. The fear of what people will say or what they will think slowly settles into the mind. Even without any solid reason, a person starts believing that their own thinking is wrong. The truth is that most people are so busy dealing with their own lives that they do not care about others' decisions as much as we imagine. The chapter also explains that self-trust is not something you are born with. It develops gradually through small decisions. When a person takes responsibility for their small choices and accepts their outcomes, their inner trust becomes stronger. Constantly seeking approval from others slowly weakens distrust. One common misunderstanding is that self-trust means being stubborn or refusing to listen to anyone. But the chapter clearly explains that trusting yourself does not mean every piece of advice is wrong. The difference is simply that the final decision is made by the person themselves, not out of fear or pressure. In real life, this mindset becomes extremely useful. Whether it is choosing a career, starting something new, or expressing your thoughts in a relationship, self-trust plays a crucial role. If a person always lives by others' opinions, they never truly understand who they are. Gradually, they become what the world wants them to be, not what they themselves want to become. The chapter also explains that completely escaping social doubt is difficult. People will always have something to say. What matters is how much importance a person gives to those words. When self-trust is strong, outside voices begin to sound quieter. At the end, the chapter calmly explains that self-trust is not built in a single day. It is an ongoing process. Every experience, every mistake, and every lesson adds to it. When a person learns to be honest with themselves, social doubt slowly loses its power. This is the most important takeaway of the chapter. Now, let us talk about Chapter 2, The Power of Clear and Minimal Speech. This chapter tries to explain why speaking less and speaking clearly is a strong skill and how fewer words are not a weakness but a source of power. This chapter focuses on the fact that most people speak a lot but communicate very little. When a person speaks too much, the value of their words begins to decrease. In contrast, a person who speaks thoughtfully and in limits is listened to more carefully. Clear and minimal speech does not mean staying silent, but saying what matters at the right time in the right words. Here, an important idea emerges. Not everything needs to be explained. When a person constantly justifies themselves, they place themselves in a weaker position. Clear speech carries confidence within it. Such people state their point and stop there. They do not feel the need to prove that they are right. The chapter also explains that silence often has more impact than words. When a person speaks less, the other person naturally tries to fill the gap. This silence creates a sense of control. Speaking too much often leads to misunderstandings, while speaking less keeps things clear. A common misconception is that people who speak less are shy or weak. This chapter clears that belief by explaining that minimal speech is not weakness but a sign of self-awareness. A person who knows what to say and what not to say is the one who truly controls the situation. In real life, this idea works in many areas. At the workplace, in relationships, or in any discussion, a person who communicates in clear and limited words is taken more seriously. Repeated explanations or over-talking signal to the other person that someone is not sure of themselves. The chapter also emphasizes the importance of pausing before speaking. This pause gives the mind time to think, and words naturally become simpler and clearer. Words spoken in haste often become a reason for regret later. In the end, it becomes clear that clear and minimal speech is a practice. It does not develop overnight. Gradually, a person learns that not everything needs to be said, not every question needs an answer, and not every silence needs to be filled. When this understanding develops, words become fewer, but their impact becomes much deeper. Now let us talk about Chapter 3, Standing Strong Without Approval. This chapter tries to explain how a person can stand firmly by their decisions even without others' approval, and how this habit slowly develops in life. This chapter revolves around the idea that most people do not make decisions for themselves but while keeping others' opinions in mind. From childhood, a habit develops where the standards of right and wrong are decided externally. Praise means right, criticism means wrong. But here it is clearly explained that until a person internally believes a decision is right, external approval can never make them feel stable. The main idea is that dependence on approval is a mental habit, not a necessity. People often assume that if everyone agrees on something, then it must be right. But the truth is that group agreement usually offers comfort, not truth. When a person takes responsibility for their own thinking, they can stand alone without feeling awkward or uncomfortable. This chapter also explains why others' opinions affect us so deeply. Humans are social beings. They want belonging. Because of this, the mind exaggerates danger, as if something terrible will happen if people get upset. In reality, in most cases, nothing happens. People talk for a while and then move on, while the person remains trapped in their own fear. A common misunderstanding is that standing without approval means being stubborn or arrogant. Here, it is clearly explained that there is a difference between confidence and stubbornness. Confidence means understanding your thinking, listening to others, and then calmly standing by your decision. It does not mean rejecting everyone's opinion, but making the final choice based on your own understanding. In real life, this idea applies in small moments. For example, not feeling the need to change your opinion just because the other person is speaking more aggressively, or letting go of the habit of constantly explaining yourself. When a person stops defending every decision, a sense of inner stability begins to form. Slowly, it becomes clear that pleasing everyone is neither possible nor necessary. This chapter also shows that standing without approval does not happen overnight. In the beginning, it feels strange and slightly scary. But as a person learns to tolerate this discomfort, the mind receives a signal that everything is fine. This practice eventually turns into strong self-confidence. In the end, the understanding emerges that real strength does not lie in making noise, but in quietly standing by your decisions. When external approval stops being the most important thing, a person feels lighter and clearer inside. This state gradually makes them more clear-headed, balanced, and self-reliant. Now let us talk about Chapter 4, Mastery of Body Presence. This chapter explores how a person's body, how they walk, stand, sit, and use gestures while speaking, communicates a great deal without words. This chapter focuses on the idea that body presence is not just about appearance, but an external expression of inner thinking and self-control. This chapter explains that people often pay more attention to words, but the real impact comes from body language. When a person enters a room, people form an impression even before they speak. This impression is connected to their confidence, clarity, and emotional control. Mastery of body presence does not mean appearing stiff or showing fake confidence at all times, but understanding how the body naturally behaves when the mind is calm and clear. One important idea in this chapter is that the body and mind are not separate. If there is nervousness, fear, or insecurity inside, it shows up in the shoulders, eyes, and movements. Similarly, when there is inner stability and self-trust, the body naturally appears relaxed yet firm. Therefore, improving body presence is not just about fixing posture, but about working on the inner mental state. It is also explained that people often mistake body presence for acting. Many believe that standing straight, pushing the chest out, or maintaining eye contact is enough. But without inner clarity, these actions quickly appear fake.
Mastery comes when movements are controlled, unnecessary gestures are reduced, and the body feels naturally balanced. Being comfortable with silence is also part of this mastery. The chapter further clarifies that excessive movement can be a sign of weakness. Constant shifting, excessive hand movements, or avoiding eye contact show inner restlessness. In contrast, limited and intentional movements reflect stability. When the body remains calm, the other person unconsciously feels that calmness as well. A common misunderstanding is that body presence is only important for powerful people. In reality, it is useful for everyone, whether at work, in social situations, or in personal life. When body presence is stable, people take you more seriously and respect boundaries. It becomes a way to establish authority without speaking. In real life, the application is simple. Being aware while walking, paying attention to posture while sitting, and controlling unnecessary expressions while speaking can gradually become habits. This is not an overnight change. As a person starts observing themselves, the body naturally becomes more disciplined. There is no need to force it. In the end, the chapter explains that body presence is not a way to display power but a natural result of inner order. When the mind is clear and emotions are controlled, the body naturally appears grounded. Mastery does not mean perfection but consistency. Over time, this presence becomes a quiet yet strong part of a person's personality.
Now let us talk about Chapter 5, Emotional Command. In this chapter, we understand how a person's emotions control their decisions and how power is often handed over to emotions without real awareness. The chapter makes it clear that emotional command does not mean suppressing emotions, but understanding and managing them consciously. This chapter focuses on the idea that most people assume whatever they feel is the truth. Anger, fear, jealousy, or excitement often fill the mind so completely that there is no space left to think. In such moments, decisions are made quickly but not correctly. Emotional command means emotions can exist, but they do not sit in the driving seat. The main idea is that every emotion carries a message, but not every message requires immediate action. Anger often signals that a boundary has been crossed. Fear shows that something is unfamiliar. But if a person speaks every time they are angry or retreats every time they feel fear, they end up harming themselves. This chapter teaches that noticing emotions and pausing to think before acting is a skill. It is also explained that many people believe staying calm means being weak. In reality, the opposite is true. A person who can manage their emotions is the one who can think clearly in difficult situations. Emotional command does not mean becoming cold, but staying balanced. Emotions are present, but decisions are made through logic. A common misunderstanding is that emotional control means never showing emotions. Doing this creates even more pressure over time. The chapter clearly explains that suppressing emotions and understanding emotions are two very different things. Suppressed emotions tend to resurface later in stronger forms, while understood emotions gradually settle down. In real life, this applies everywhere. At work, if something feels insulting, choosing to pause instead of reacting immediately is emotional command. In relationships, listening first instead of making decisions in anger is emotional command. In matters related to money, career, or respect, emotions have the strongest influence, and that is where the lesson of this chapter becomes most valuable. It is also explained that people who recognize their own emotions are better able to understand others' emotions as well. This reduces conflict and makes communication clearer. Emotional command develops gradually. It is not a one-day achievement. Every time a person pauses and reflects, this skill becomes slightly stronger. In the end, the chapter reminds us that emotions are not enemies. They are part of being human. Problems arise when emotions start making decisions without being checked. When a person learns that feeling and deciding are two separate steps, their thinking becomes clearer, more stable, and more reliable.
This is the true understanding of emotional command. Now let us talk about Chapter 6, The Strength to Say No. This chapter explores the idea that saying no is not rudeness or weakness, but a necessary skill that helps a person stay in control of their own life. It clearly explains that saying yes every time is not a sign of being a good person. Often, it becomes a way of exhausting oneself and lowering one's own value. This chapter focuses on why people struggle to say no. One major reason is the desire to not upset others. There is often a fear that refusing will damage relationships or create misunderstandings. Slowly, this turns into a habit where a person places others' expectations before their own needs. This is where problems begin, because repeatedly putting oneself last builds inner exhaustion and irritation. This chapter also explains that saying no is actually clear communication. When a person refuses calmly and honestly, the other person understands the boundary. Saying no does not mean making excuses or lying, but expressing the truth in simple words. For example, if there is no time, clearly stating that it is not possible right now. This gives clarity to the other person and prevents unnecessary confusion in relationships. A common misconception is that people who say no are selfish. This chapter breaks that belief. It explains that being selfish and having self-respect are two very different things. When a person understands their limits and makes decisions accordingly, they become more balanced and reliable in the long run. On the other hand, someone who says yes to everything often fails to keep promises, which slowly reduces their credibility. This chapter also makes it clear that saying no is a skill developed through practice. In the beginning, it feels uncomfortable and often brings guilt, but over time it becomes easier. When a person sees that life continues normally and relationships do not fall apart after saying no, confidence grows. Gradually, they realize that responding to every request is not their responsibility. In real life, its impact is visible everywhere. At work, where extra tasks are casually handed over. Among friends, where being part of every plan is considered mandatory. Even in families where expectations are placed without discussion. The core message of this chapter is that when a person clearly defines their limits, others start taking them more seriously. This is not about going against others, but about standing up for oneself. In the end, the chapter concludes with a calm understanding that saying no does not weaken relationships, but makes them clearer and more honest. When a person spends their energy, time, and attention thoughtfully, life feels more stable and controlled. This strength does not come from the outside, it comes from inner clarity about what is right and what is not. That clarity gives a person the power to say no without anger and without fear.
Now let us talk about Chapter 7, Knowing Your Own Worth. In this chapter, we understand how a person recognizes their own value and why this understanding influences every decision in life. This chapter focuses on the idea that knowing your worth is not about arrogance. It is an inner understanding of what a person deserves and what they do not. Very often, people start measuring their value based on external opinions, praise or rejection. When someone praises them, they feel good. When someone ignores them, they start feeling small. This chapter explains that such thinking slowly weakens a person. The main idea is that self-worth does not come from outside. Neither money, nor status, nor people's approval defines a person's true value. Value is built internally through personal standards, decisions, and boundaries. When a person understands themselves and accepts both their strengths and weaknesses, a stable sense of self-worth develops. Another important concept is that a person who does not know their worth often gets trapped in pleasing others. They say yes too often, adjust more than necessary, and sometimes even tolerate disrespect. This does not happen because they are weak, but because they believe they do not deserve better.
This chapter shows how such thinking slowly destroys self-respect. These ideas matter because every relationship, every opportunity, and every decision in life is connected to self-worth. If a person undervalues themselves, they choose the wrong people, accept bad deals, and block their own growth. On the other hand, someone who knows their worth remains calm, sets boundaries, and walks away from the wrong things without conflict. A common misunderstanding is that knowing your worth means thinking you are above others. This chapter clearly explains that self-worth and arrogance are different. Arrogance puts others down, while self-worth simply refuses to undervalue oneself. There is no need to compete with anyone. In real life, these ideas apply in very simple ways. For example, when someone repeatedly crosses your boundaries and you remain silent, it reflects a lack of self-worth. Or when you walk away from an opportunity just because you feel you are not good enough. According to this chapter, such moments require honest self-questioning, whether the fear comes from the outside or from flawed inner thinking. Knowing your worth also means not breaking down because of rejection. If something does not work out, instead of seeing it as personal failure, a person views it as a mismatch. This mindset builds emotional strength and brings clarity in decision-making. The chapter ends with the understanding that once a person calmly recognizes their worth, the need to prove themselves reduces. They react less, explain less, and feel less restless. Their presence becomes enough because they understand themselves. Now let us talk about Chapter 8, Comfortable Silence, Unshakable Presence. This chapter explores why silence is often mistaken for weakness, when in reality, the right kind of silence can become one of a person's strongest qualities. It also explains how someone can make their presence felt without speaking, and why it is not necessary to say something at every moment. The chapter begins by addressing common misunderstandings about silence. Most people believe that the one who speaks more is confident, while the one who stays quiet is either fearful or lacks knowledge. But reality is often the opposite. When a person is comfortable within themselves, they do not feel the need to fill every empty space with words. Such silence does not come from helplessness, but from awareness. This chapter also explains the difference between uncomfortable silence and comfortable silence. Uncomfortable silence comes from inner anxiety, where a person feels they must speak or else be misunderstood. Comfortable silence, on the other hand, is calm. The person's body language is steady, and they are not worried about what others think. This silence gradually turns into an unshakable presence. The chapter explains why silence creates power. When a person speaks less, their words naturally carry more value. People listen more carefully because they know this person does not speak without reason. In contrast, someone who constantly talks slowly loses seriousness. Silence becomes a tool of control, not distance. Another important point is that silence reflects emotional control. When a person does not react immediately in anger, fear, or jealousy, and instead remains calm, it sends a clear message that decisions are guided by thought, not emotion. This builds trust in relationships, work environments, and conversations. The chapter also clears a common misconception that silence means ignoring others or becoming cold. This is not true. Silence means being present, listening attentively, and using words only when necessary. It does not create distance, instead it deepens communication. In real life, this idea applies in many situations. In meetings, it is not necessary to speak on every point. Often, listening quietly and speaking at the right moment has more impact. In relationships, not every silence needs to be treated as a problem. Sometimes sitting together without words strengthens the connection. In public spaces, a calm and grounded person naturally draws attention without effort. By the end of the chapter, it becomes clear that silence is not emptiness, but a state of being. When a person becomes comfortable within themselves, they no longer rush to prove anything. Such silence shows inner strength, and that strength keeps their presence steady and unshakable.
Now let us talk about Chapter 9, ownership of mistakes. In this chapter, we understand why taking responsibility for our mistakes feels so difficult and how this very responsibility makes a person stronger from within. This chapter focuses on the fact that most people, the moment a mistake happens, try to hide it, justify it, or place the blame on someone else. This often happens automatically. The mind immediately goes into self-protection mode. A person fears accepting that they were wrong because they believe it will weaken their image. But in reality, this mindset itself becomes the biggest obstacle. The chapter explains that making mistakes is a natural part of being human. No one is perfect. The difference lies in this: some people accept their mistakes, while others ignore or deny them. A person who takes ownership of their mistakes does not lie to themselves. They can clearly see where things went wrong and why. An important point here is that taking ownership does not mean attacking yourself or drowning in shame. Many people misunderstand this. They believe that admitting a mistake will make them look weak. The truth is that calmly accepting a mistake is a form of mental strength. It shows that a person can face reality. The chapter also explains that when a person avoids responsibility for their mistakes, their mind stops learning. If the cause is always searched for outside, there is no reason to change anything within. As a result, the same patterns repeat, the same wrong decisions, the same outcomes, and the same frustration. In real life, this impact is very clear. At work, people owning their mistakes are trusted more. Others know that this person will speak honestly and focus on solutions. In contrast, those who constantly make excuses slowly create distance around themselves, no matter how skilled they may be. The same applies to relationships. When a person accepts their mistake, the other person feels taken seriously. This builds trust. But when explanations are constant and blame is shifted, bitterness slowly starts to build in the relationship. The chapter also clears another misunderstanding, that taking ownership means taking responsibility for everything, even for things that were not under your control. Ownership means accepting only what was truly in your control. This prevents unnecessary guilt and allows a person to think realistically. In the end, the chapter explains that accepting mistakes is not a one-time habit, but a mindset. As a person gradually learns this, their confidence starts building from within rather than from external validation. They become less shaken by others' opinions because they know they are standing with the truth. This mindset leads a person towards greater clarity, stability, and long-term growth. Now let us talk about Chapter 10, Freedom from the Need to Impress. This chapter explores how the habit of impressing others develops, how it works internally, and why breaking free from it is necessary. This chapter focuses on how people often start shaping their decisions, their words, and even their personality around what others might think. Slowly, impressing stops being a natural behavior and turns into pressure. A person begins to present themselves not as they truly are, but as who they believe others want them to be. The main idea is that the need to impress always comes from insecurity. When inner self-worth is unclear, the search for external approval begins. Praise, attention, and acceptance become a kind of support system. But this support is temporary because people's opinions keep changing. The chapter also explains that in the process of trying to impress, a person wastes energy in the wrong places. Too much time goes into thinking about what to wear, what to say, and how to react. This exhausts the mind. Gradually, authenticity decreases and behavior starts to feel artificial, no matter how smart a person tries to appear. Another important point discussed is that many people believe impressing others is a sign of confidence. In reality, true confidence appears where there is no need to perform. When there is inner stability, external reactions lose their power. The chapter also clears the misunderstanding that pleasing people and impressing people are the same thing. Respect and connection develop naturally, they cannot be forced.
When a person constantly tries to keep others happy, they forget their own limits and resentment slowly starts to build in the relationship. In real life, the effects are easy to see. At work, people agree more than necessary. In relationships, they fail to express themselves. In social situations, overacting begins. All of this happens because of an underlying fear of rejection. The chapter further explains that freedom arrives when a person accepts that not everyone can be pleased. Some people will like you, some will not, and that is natural. When this acceptance settles in, behavior becomes lighter and decisions become clearer. In the end, the chapter concludes with a calm understanding that letting go of the need to impress is not aggression or carelessness. It is a state of inner peace where a person remains honest with themselves. When the burden of performance drops, thoughts, actions, and relationships all become clearer and easier.
Now let us talk about Chapter 11, Keeping Promises Made to Yourself. This chapter explores how the promises a person makes to themselves and whether they keep or break them affect their thinking, self-trust, and daily habits. The focus here is more on the inner world than the outer one. The main focus of this chapter is that promises made to oneself are just as important as promises made to others. Often, people take commitments to others seriously, but treat promises to themselves lightly. For example, deciding to read a little every day, sleep on time, or work on a habit, only to break that promise after a few days. Slowly, this creates a habit where trust in one's own word starts to weaken. The chapter explains that every time a person breaks a promise made to themselves, their inner self-trust weakens slightly. It is not one big shock, but a series of small ones. A person may not consciously think that trust is breaking, but the mind learns that their own words do not need to be taken seriously. This is why making bigger decisions later begins to feel difficult. It is also explained that keeping promises to yourself is not about becoming a perfect person. Making mistakes or slipping sometimes is natural. The problem begins when a person repeatedly lies to themselves without awareness, like saying everything will change from tomorrow, while knowing deep down that it will not. This habit slowly weakens the mind. The chapter also clears a common misunderstanding. Many people believe that promises can only be kept when motivation is present. The truth is that motivation is not consistent every day. If promises depend only on mood, most of them will break. That is why promises need to be small and realistic so they feel possible to keep. In real life, this means making only those promises that you can genuinely follow through on. Instead of making grand plans, it is better to take small steps. If you decide to read daily, even reading a little in the beginning is enough. When a person keeps small promises, trust in themselves slowly starts to return. This trust does not come from outside, it is built internally. The chapter also shows that discipline naturally develops when promises to oneself are kept. This is not forced discipline, but a quiet habit. A person begins to know that what they say, they will do. This brings clarity to decisions and reduces mental confusion. In the end, the chapter concludes with a simple yet deep understanding. Just as a person expects trust from others, they must also earn their own trust. Keeping promises made to oneself is the foundation of that trust. When this foundation is strong, the rest of life's decisions begin to feel clearer and easier. Now let us talk about Chapter 12, Setting and Defending Boundaries. This chapter explores what boundaries are, why setting them is important, and how to defend them calmly without arguments or guilt. This chapter focuses on the idea that every person has their own limits. These limits are not only about time or energy, but also about emotions, values, and self-respect. When a person does not clearly define their boundaries, others may cross them, intentionally or unintentionally.
Over time, it begins to feel like people are taking advantage, or the person starts feeling undervalued. One key idea in this chapter is that setting boundaries is not selfish. Many people believe that saying no or showing limits will make them seem like a bad person. In reality, expressing boundaries is a sign of self-awareness and responsibility. People who do not express their limits often remain frustrated internally, and that frustration later turns into anger or silence. The chapter also explains that boundaries are not always created through words. Many times, boundaries are set through behavior. For example, always answering calls immediately, replying to every message instantly, or saying yes to every request. These actions signal that there are no limits. When a person brings consistency and clarity into their actions, others naturally understand where to stop. This idea matters because relationships without boundaries become unbalanced. One person gives more and the other takes more. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion, low self-respect, and mental stress. Boundaries do not damage relationships, they make them healthier by clarifying what can and cannot be expected. A common misunderstanding is that boundaries are only for strong people. The truth is that learning boundaries is a practice. In the beginning, it feels awkward and brings fear about what others might think. But as a person learns to express themselves calmly and clearly, confidence grows. Defending boundaries does not mean arguing or giving long explanations. Often, a simple and short response is enough. In real life, these ideas apply everywhere. Overtime at work, being constantly available to friends, emotional pressure within families, or lack of space in relationships. When a person decides how much they can give and where to stop, life starts feeling more stable. People may react at first, but in the long run, they begin to respect that clarity. The chapter ends with the understanding that boundaries are not walls, but clear lines. These lines do not separate a person from others, they connect them more deeply to themselves. When a person recognizes their limits and holds them calmly, relationships experience less drama, less confusion, and more balance. That is the true value of boundaries. आइए अब बात करते हैं चैप्टर 13 एक्शन इन द प्रेजेंस ऑफ फियर की। इस चैप्टर में ये समझने की कोशिश की जाती है कि डर के रहते हुए भी इंसान कैसे सही एक्शन ले सकता है और क्यों डर का होना किसी भी एक्शन को रोकने की असली वजह नहीं होता। ये चैप्टर इस बात पर फोकस करता है कि डर कोई अजीब या गलत चीज नहीं है। डर हर इंसान के अंदर होता है। फर्क सिर्फ इतना होता है कि कुछ लोग डर के आने पर रुक जाते हैं और कुछ लोग डर को साथ लेकर आगे बढ़ते हैं। यहाँ ये साफ किया जाता है कि बहादुरी का मतलब डर का ना होना नहीं है, बल्कि डर के बावजूद काम करना ही असली एक्शन है। मुख्य आइडिया ये है कि इंसान अक्सर ये सोच लेता है कि पहले डर खत्म होगा, फिर एक्शन लिया जाएगा, लेकिन असल जिंदगी में ऐसा लगभग कभी नहीं होता। डर तब तक पूरी तरह खत्म नहीं होता जब तक इंसान खुद उस डर के सामने खड़ा नहीं होता। एक्शन लेने से पहले डर का इंतजार करना असल में खुद को लंबे समय तक एक ही जगह पर रोक कर रखना है। यहाँ यह भी समझाया जाता है कि डर ज्यादातर भविष्य से जुड़ा होता है। दिमाग ऐसी चीजों की कल्पना करने लगता है जो अभी हुई ही नहीं है। रिजल्ट, जजमेंट, फेलियर या दूसरों की राय, ये सब डर को और बड़ा बना देते हैं। लेकिन जब इंसान सिर्फ अगले छोटे एक्शन पर ध्यान देता है तो डर की पकड़ अपने आप थोड़ी ढीली पड़ने लगती है। एक और जरूरी बात यह है कि डर और रिस्क को अक्सर एक ही मान लिया जाता है, जबकि दोनों अलग चीजें हैं। रिस्क को समझा जा सकता है, मैनेज किया जा सकता है, लेकिन डर ज्यादातर इमोशनल रिएक्शन होता है। जब इंसान डर की वजह से एक्शन नहीं लेता, तब वो असल में रिस्क का नहीं, अपनी फीलिंग्स का फैसला मान रहा होता है। इस चैप्टर में यह भी क्लियर किया जाता है कि परफेक्ट टाइम या परफेक्ट कॉन्फिडेंस जैसी कोई चीज नहीं होती। जो लोग कुछ करते हैं वे भी पूरी तरह तैयार महसूस नहीं करते। वे बस इतना तय करते हैं कि डर के बावजूद पहला कदम लिया जाएगा। पहला कदम छोटा होता है, लेकिन वही आगे की क्लैरिटी बनाता है। एक आम गलतफहमी यह है कि डर का मतलब यह है कि इंसान गलत रास्ते पर है, जबकि कई बार डर इस बात का संकेत होता है कि इंसान कुछ नया और जरूरी करने जा रहा है। अगर हर बार डर देखकर पीछे हट जाया जाए तो ग्रोथ अपने आप रुक जाती है। रियल लाइफ में इसका मतलब ये है कि हर बड़े या छोटे फैसले में डर मौजूद रह सकता है। नई जॉब, नया काम, किसी से बात करना या अपनी राय रखना, हर जगह थोड़ा डर रहता है। लेकिन जो लोग डर के साथ भी एक्शन लेते हैं, वही धीरे धीरे अंदर से मजबूत बनते हैं। हर बार एक्शन लेने से ये भरोसा बढ़ता है कि डर संभाला जा सकता है। अंत में ये चैप्टर शांति से ये बात समझाता है कि डर कोई दुश्मन नहीं है। उसे हटाने की जरूरत नहीं होती, बस उसे कंट्रोल में रखकर आगे बढ़ना होता है। जब एक्शन डर से पहले नहीं बल्कि डर के साथ लिया जाता है, तब इंसान अपनी लिमिट्स को धीरे धीरे पार करना शुरू कर देता है। आइए अब बात करते हैं चैप्टर 14, फिल्टरिंग ओपिनियंस, प्रोटेक्टिंग फोकस की। इसमें यह समझने की कोशिश होती है कि दूसरों की राय को कैसे छांटना है और अपने ध्यान को कैसे सुरक्षित रखना है, ताकि दिमाग बेवजह के शोर में ना फंसे। ये चैप्टर इस बात पर केंद्रित है कि हमारी जिंदगी में ओपिनियंस की कोई कमी नहीं होती। हर इंसान कुछ ना कुछ सलाह देता रहता है, चाहे मांगी गई हो या नहीं। सोशल मीडिया, परिवार, दोस्त, ऑफिस, हर जगह से आवाजें आती रहती हैं। इस चैप्टर में बताया गया है कि समस्या ओपिनियंस की संख्या नहीं है। समस्या ये है कि हम हर राय को बराबर महत्व दे देते हैं। इससे फोकस बिखरने लगता है और फैसले कमजोर हो जाते हैं। मुख्य आइडिया यह है कि हर ओपिनियन को अपनाने की जरूरत नहीं होती। कुछ राय उपयोगी होती हैं, कुछ सिर्फ शोर होती हैं। फिल्टरिंग का मतलब ये नहीं है कि सबको अनदेखा कर दिया जाए, बल्कि ये समझना कि किसकी बात सुननी है और किसकी नहीं। जिन लोगों के पास अनुभव है, जिनकी सोच संतुलित है और जिनकी नीयत साफ है, उनकी राय ज्यादा मूल्यवान होती है। बाकी राय अक्सर भावनाओं, डर या जलन से आती है। चैप्टर ये भी समझाता है कि फोकस एक सीमित संसाधन है। दिन भर में दिमाग जितना ध्यान दे सकता है, उसकी एक सीमा होती है। जब हम हर ओपिनियन पर रिएक्ट करते हैं, तो वही फोकस खत्म हो जाता है। नतीजा ये होता है कि जरूरी कामों पर गहराई से सोचने की ताकत नहीं बचती। इसलिए फोकस को बचाना उतना ही जरूरी है जितना समय को बचाना। ये आइडिया इसलिए मायने रखता है क्योंकि आज की दुनिया में डिस्ट्रैक्शन बहुत तेज है। अगर हर किसी की बात को दिल पर लिया जाए, तो अपनी दिशा साफ रखना मुश्किल हो जाता है। फिल्टरिंग से दिमाग शांत रहता है और निर्णय ज्यादा स्पष्ट होते हैं। ये आदत धीरे धीरे आत्मविश्वास भी बढ़ाती है, क्योंकि इंसान बाहरी शोर पर कम निर्भर रहने लगता है। एक आम गलतफहमी ये होती है कि ओपिनियंस को फिल्टर करना मतलब घमंडी होना। असल में ऐसा नहीं है। इसका मतलब सिर्फ इतना है कि अपनी मानसिक ऊर्जा को सही जगह लगाना। हर राय को मानना भी कमजोरी हो सकती है। दूसरी गलतफहमी यह है कि ज्यादा राय लेने से बेहतर फैसला होता है। कई बार ज्यादा राय उलझन बढ़ा देती है। रियल लाइफ में यह कॉन्सेप्ट बहुत साफ दिखता है। जैसे करियर चुनते समय अगर 10 लोग 10 अलग बातें कहें, तो कंफ्यूजन बढ़ेगा। लेकिन अगर कुछ चुने हुए लोगों की बात सुनी जाए, तो दिशा साफ रहेगी। इसी तरह सोशल मीडिया पर हर कमेंट को सीरियस लेना मानसिक थकान पैदा करता है। फिल्टरिंग से सिर्फ वही इनपुट अंदर जाता है जो काम का है। चैप्टर का निष्कर्ष शांत और व्यावहारिक है। फोकस की रक्षा करना एक स्किल है जो अभ्यास से आती है। जब इंसान सीख जाता है कि किसकी सुननी है और किसे छोड़ना है, तब दिमाग हल्का रहता है। कम शोर, ज्यादा स्पष्टता और ज्यादा संतुलन, यही इस चैप्टर का असली सार है।
आइए बात करते हैं चैप्टर 15, बीइंग फुली कंफर्टेबल विद योरसेल्फ। इस चैप्टर में यह समझने की कोशिश की गई है कि इंसान खुद के साथ सहज कैसे होता है और क्यों खुद को जैसा है वैसा स्वीकार करना अंदरूनी ताकत की सबसे बड़ी निशानी होती है। ये चैप्टर इस बात पर फोकस करता है कि ज्यादातर लोग बाहर से कॉन्फिडेंट दिखना चाहते हैं, लेकिन अंदर से लगातार खुद को जज करते रहते हैं। खुद से कंफर्टेबल होना किसी रोल को निभाना नहीं है, बल्कि ये मान लेना है कि परफेक्ट होना जरूरी नहीं है। इंसान के अंदर कमियां होती हैं, अनकंफर्टेबल फीलिंग्स होती हैं, और ये सब नॉर्मल है। जब कोई व्यक्ति इन्हें छुपाने की बजाय एक्सेप्ट करता है, तभी असली आराम महसूस होता है। मुख्य आइडिया यह है कि खुद के साथ कंफर्टेबल होना मतलब हर समय खुश रहना नहीं है। इसका मतलब है अपने डर, अपनी कमजोरियों और अपनी लिमिट्स को पहचानना, बिना खुद से लड़ाई किए। अक्सर लोग सोचते हैं कि कॉन्फिडेंस का मतलब है कभी नर्वस ना होना, लेकिन सच ये है कि नर्वस होना इंसानी नेचर है। फर्क सिर्फ इतना है कि कोई व्यक्ति उस नर्वसनेस से भागता है या उसे रहने देता है। इस चैप्टर में यह भी बताया गया है कि लोग दूसरों की नजरों से खुद को देखने की आदत बना लेते हैं। क्या लोग क्या सोचेंगे, मैं अजीब तो नहीं लग रहा, मैंने गलत तो नहीं बोल दिया, ये सवाल धीरे धीरे दिमाग में शोर बन जाते हैं। जब इंसान खुद के साथ कंफर्टेबल नहीं होता, तब वो हर सिचुएशन में अप्रूवल ढूंढता है। लेकिन जैसे ही ये जरूरत कम होती है, अंदर एक स्थिरता आने लगती है।
यह आइडिया इसलिए ज़रूरी है क्योंकि जब इंसान खुद से जुड़ा होता है, तब उसकी एनर्जी दूसरों को इम्प्रेस करने में बर्बाद नहीं होती। वो अपनी बात साफ तरीके से रख पाता है, बिना ज़रूरत के एक्सप्लेन किए। ऐसे लोग साइलेंस में भी अनकंफर्टेबल नहीं होते। उन्हें हर खाली पल भरने की ज़रूरत नहीं लगती, क्योंकि वे खुद की मौजूदगी से भाग नहीं रहे होते। एक आम गलतफहमी ये है कि खुद से कंफर्टेबल होना मतलब सेल्फिश या लापरवाह होना है, लेकिन ऐसा नहीं है। इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि इंसान दूसरों की फीलिंग्स को इग्नोर करे। इसका मतलब है कि वो खुद को लगातार नीचा दिखाकर दूसरों को ऊपर नहीं रखता। वो फीडबैक सुन सकता है, लेकिन हर राय को अपनी पहचान नहीं बनाता। रियल लाइफ में ये तब दिखता है जब कोई इंसान ग्रुप में चुप बैठ सकता है और उसे अजीब नहीं लगता, जब वो अपनी पसंद और नापसंद को बिना शर्म के मान लेता है, जब वो अपनी गलतियों को छुपाने की बजाय शांति से स्वीकार कर लेता है। ऐसे लोग दूसरों की तुलना में कम रिएक्ट करते हैं और ज्यादा सोच समझ कर जवाब देते हैं। ये चैप्टर ये भी साफ करता है कि खुद से कंफर्टेबल होना एक दिन में नहीं होता। ये छोटे छोटे ऑब्जर्वेशन से शुरू होता है। अपने थॉट्स को देखना, अपने रिएक्शन को समझना और ये मान लेना कि हर दिन स्ट्रांग महसूस करना जरूरी नहीं है। जैसे जैसे इंसान खुद को ज्यादा समझता है, वैसे वैसे बाहर की दुनिया का प्रेशर कम असर करने लगता है। अंत में ये समझ आता है कि जब इंसान खुद के साथ शांति में होता है, तब उसे साबित करने की जल्दी नहीं रहती। उसकी मौजूदगी हल्की लेकिन स्थिर होती है। वो जैसा है उसी में कंफर्ट महसूस करता है, और यही कंफर्ट धीरे धीरे उसकी सबसे बड़ी ताकत बन जाता है।